Everything you have ever loved will be destroyed. The body you inhabit is decaying at this moment, losing cells, accumulating damage, drifting inexorably toward the dissolution that biology calls death. The house you live in is deteriorating, the paint is fading, the wood is rotting, the foundation is settling, and the structure is being returned, grain by grain, to the earth from which it was built. The star that warms your planet is burning through its fuel, converting 4 million tons of hydrogen into helium every second, exhausting the nuclear reserves that have sustained it for 5 billion years, and that will sustain it for 5 billion more before the fuel runs out and the star swells, reddens, and dies. The galaxy that contains your star is dispersing, its stars drifting apart, its gas dissipating, its structure dissolving over timescales that dwarf the lifetime of any individual star. And the universe itself is expanding, stretching the distances between the galaxies, diluting the energy, cooling the radiation, and approaching, over incomprehensible timescales, the state of maximum entropy that the physics calls the heat death. The heat death is the end of everything. Not the end of matter, matter will still exist. Not the end of energy, energy will still exist. But the end of structure, the end of complexity, the end of difference, the end of the gradients and the asymmetries and the organized patterns that make things happen. In the heat death, every temperature is the same, every density is the same, every point of space is indistinguishable from every other point. Nothing happens because nothing can happen, because happening requires a difference, a gradient, a flow from high to low, and in the heat death there are no differences left. The universe is not dead. It is worse than dead. It is featureless, a vast, uniform, structureless expanse in which every possible event has already occurred and no further events are possible. The timeline of the heat death is measured not in billions, but in powers of 10. In approximately 5 billion years, the sun will exhaust its hydrogen fuel and expand into a red giant, engulfing the inner planets. In approximately 100 billion years, the last stars in the universe will exhaust their fuel and fade into darkness. In approximately 10 to the 40th years, the last remaining stellar remnants, the white dwarfs, the neutron stars, the black holes will have evaporated through quantum processes, returning their mass energy to the radiation field. And in approximately 10 to the 100th years are Google years, a number so large that writing it out would require more zeros than there are atoms in the observable universe. The last thermal fluctuations will have smoothed out, and the universe will have reached its final state. Maximum entropy, minimum structure, the absolute and irreversible end of everything that the word something has ever meant. The physicist Brian Cox has described this with characteristic directness. The arrow of time points toward the heat death. Everything we see, everything we know, everything we love is a temporary fluctuation in the universe's relentless march toward maximum disorder. We are brief patterns in the chaos, beautiful, complex, aware, but temporary. The second law guarantees it. This is the destiny that the second law of thermodynamics prescribes for everything that exists. The second law states that the entropy of a closed system, the measure of its disorder, its randomness, its lack of usable structure, always increases. Entropy never decreases spontaneously. Order never increases spontaneously. And the direction of spontaneous change is always from order to disorder, from structure to chaos, from the organized to the disorganized, from the low entropy past to the high entropy future. The second law is not a suggestion. It is not a tendency. It is a law, the most statistically robust law in all of physics, violated by no known process, contradicted by no known experiment, and enforced by the overwhelming probability that disordered states vastly outnumber ordered states in the space of possible configurations. The second law is statistical. It does not say that entropy cannot decrease. It says that a spontaneous decrease is so overwhelmingly improbable that it never happens in practice. The probability of a broken cup spontaneously reassembling itself is not zero. It is approximately 10 to the minus 10 to the 23rd, a number so incomprehensibly small that if every atom in the observable universe were a random cup reassembly experiment running once per Planck time since the Big Bang, the expected number of successful reassemblies would still be effectively zero. The second law is not violated because violation is impossible. It is not violated because violation is so improbable that the universe's entire age and extent are insufficient to produce a single instance. The biological expression of the second law is aging. Your body is a low entropy structure, an extraordinarily organized arrangement of atoms that requires continuous energy input to maintain its organization against the entropic tide. The energy input comes from food, from the chemical energy stored in the molecular bonds of the nutrients you consume. The body converts this chemical energy into the work of maintaining its structure, and the conversion produces waste heat disordered, high entropy thermal energy that the body radiates into the environment. The aging process is the progressive failure of this maintenance, the gradual accumulation of damage, the gradual loss of organization, and the gradual approach toward the equilibrium state that biology calls death, and that thermodynamics calls maximum entropy. The second law explains why everything decays. The cup shatters and does not reassemble. The ice melts and does not refreeze in a warm room. The body ages and does not rejuvenate. The star burns out and does not reignite. Each of these processes is a journey from a low entropy state to a high entropy state, from a state of organization, structure, and usable energy to a state of disorganization, randomness, and dissipated energy. The journey is one-directional. The return is forbidden not by any force or barrier, but by the overwhelming improbability of the entropy decrease that the return would require. The physicist Arthur Eddington described the second law with a gravity that reflects its cosmic significance. The law that entropy always increases holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. The second law is the law of laws, the principle that governs the direction of every process, the fate of every structure, and the ultimate destiny of the universe itself. The arrow of time is the experiential expression of the second law. Time appears to flow from past to future because entropy increases from past to future. The past is the direction of lower entropy. The future is the direction of higher entropy. And the experience of temporal flow, the sense that time moves, that moments pass, that the present recedes into the past and is replaced by the future, is the conscious perception of the entropy gradient that the second law establishes. Without the second law, there would be no arrow of time. Without the arrow of time, there would be no experience of change. And without the experience of change, there would be no experience of decay. No aging, no death, no dissolution, no loss. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who formulated the statistical mechanical foundation of the second law in the 19th century, was so tormented by the law's implications that he struggled with depression throughout his career. Boltzmann understood, more clearly than anyone of his generation, that the second law is not merely a physical principle. It is an existential sentence, a declaration that everything organized, everything complex, everything beautiful, everything alive is temporary, destined to dissolve into the featureless uniformity that statistical mechanics identifies as the overwhelmingly probable final state. Boltzmann's entropy formula S equals K log W, carved on his tombstone in Vienna, is the mathematical expression of the universe's destiny. The entropy S increases as the number of possible microstates W increases, and the increase continues until the maximum is reached and no further change is possible. The second law is the reason that the past is different from the future. The past contained lower entropy, more structure, more organization, more usable energy. The future will contain higher entropy, less structure, less organization, less usable energy. And the present is the boundary, the moving front of the entropic dissolution, the moment at which the past's organization is being converted, irreversibly and inexorably, into the future's disorder. But here is the extraordinary thing: not everything decays. In the midst of the universal dissolution that the second law prescribes, there are quantities that do not change. There are structures that do not decay. There are principles that remain constant while everything around them crumbles. And the identification of these unchanging quantities, the things that persist while everything else perishes, is one of the deepest achievements of modern physics. The identification of the unchanging is, in some ways, more important than the identification of the changing, because the unchanging is the foundation on which the changing rests. The changing world, the world of structures and processes and events, is built on a substrate of unchanging quantities and unchanging laws. The structures change, the substrate does not. The events unfold, the laws that govern them do not. And the question of what constitutes the unchanging substrate, what remains when everything that can change has changed, is the question that leads from physics to metaphysics, from science to philosophy, and from the observable to the fundamental. The physicist Paul Dirac described the relationship between the changing and the unchanging with an insight that bridges the scientific and the philosophical. God used beautiful mathematics in creating the world. Whether or not one accepts the theological framing, Dirac's point is precise. The mathematical structure is the unchanging foundation, and the physical world is the changing expression of that foundation. The foundation does not participate in the change. It is the ground of the change. The eternal, unchanging, mathematically precise structure from which the temporal, changing, physically expressed world arises. The first unchanging quantity is energy. The first law of thermodynamics, the law of energy conservation, states that the total energy of a closed system never changes. Energy can be converted from one form to another, from kinetic to potential, from chemical to thermal, from nuclear to electromagnetic. But the total amount of energy is constant. It is never created. It is never destroyed. It is the same now as it was at the moment of the Big Bang, and the same as it will be at the heat death. The forms change, the distribution changes, the usability changes. The second law ensures that usable energy is progressively converted into unusable heat, but the total is constant. The energy that constitutes your body, your planet, your star, and your galaxy is the same energy that existed at the beginning of the universe. It has changed form billions of times. It has never changed in quantity. The second unchanging quantity is quantum information. The unitarity of quantum mechanics, which we established in our investigation of death and reincarnation, guarantees that the total information content of a quantum system is absolutely conserved. Information is never created. Information is never destroyed. The Schrödinger equation preserves information with the same rigor that the first law preserves energy. And the resolution of the black hole information paradox, Susskind's demonstration that even a black hole cannot destroy quantum information, established that the conservation of information is absolute, unconditional, and inviolable under every physical condition that the universe can produce. The conservation of information has a specific implication that the conservation of energy does not. the information that constitutes you is not destroyed when you die. Your body's energy is conserved, it is redistributed into the environment, converted from biological energy into thermal energy, and dissipated into the surroundings. But your information is also conserved, the quantum state that encoded your memories, your personality, your specific pattern of consciousness is not destroyed. It is dispersed, delocalized, and scrambled beyond any practical possibility of recovery. But it is not gone. It is preserved in the quantum state of the universe, in the entanglement structure of the vacuum, in the correlations between the particles that your body's quantum state interacted with during your life. The conservation of information connects to the conservation of energy through a deep relationship that the physicist Rolf Landauer identified in 1961. Information is physical. Erasing one bit of information requires the expenditure of a minimum amount of energy kT ln2, where K is Boltzmann's constant and T is the temperature. The relationship between information and energy is not metaphorical. It is thermodynamic, a precise, measurable, experimentally confirmed connection between the abstract concept of information and the physical concept of energy. The conservation of information and the conservation of energy are two expressions of the same underlying principle. The total content of the universe, its energy and its information is constant, unchanging, and indestructible. The physicist Jacob Bekenstein demonstrated that the connection extends to gravity. The information content of a black hole is proportional to the area of its event horizon, and the entropy of the black hole is proportional to its information content. The relationship between information, energy, and gravity, the three pillars of the physical world, is the deepest expression of the unchanging structure that underlies the changing surface. The pillars do not change. The structures they support do. The third unchanging quantity is the laws of physics themselves. The laws of physics do not change. Newton's law of gravitation is the same today as it was when the universe was 1 second old. Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism are the same in this galaxy as they are in a galaxy 10 billion light-years away. The speed of light is the same in every reference frame, at every location, at every moment. And the quantum mechanical principles, the superposition principle, the uncertainty principle, the unitarity of evolution are the same everywhere and everywhen in the observable universe. The constancy of the laws is not merely an empirical observation. It is a consequence of the deepest symmetries of the physical world. The physicist Emmy Noether demonstrated, in her famous theorem of 1918, that every continuous symmetry of the laws of physics corresponds to a conserved quantity. The symmetry of the laws under time translation, the fact that the laws are the same today as they were yesterday and will be tomorrow, corresponds to the conservation of energy. The symmetry under spatial translation, the fact that the laws are the same here as they are there, corresponds to the conservation of momentum. And the symmetry under rotation, the fact that the laws are the same in every direction, corresponds to the conservation of angular momentum. The deeper symmetries of the physical world, the gauge symmetries that underlie the electromagnetic, weak, and strong forces, produce deeper conservation laws. The gauge symmetry of electromagnetism produces the conservation of electric charge. The gauge symmetry of the strong force produces the conservation of color charge. And the gauge symmetry of the weak force produces the conservation of weak isospin. Each conservation law is the mathematical expression of an unchanging structure, a symmetry that the physical world displays, that the changing phenomena obey, and that the second law's entropic dissolution cannot touch. The physicist Chen-Ning Yang, who shared the Nobel Prize for the discovery of parity violation, has described the gauge symmetries as the most fundamental structures in the physical world, more fundamental than the particles, more fundamental than the forces, and more fundamental than space-time itself. The symmetries are the bedrock, the particles are the excitations of the symmetric fields. The forces are the consequences of the symmetric interactions, and the space-time is the arena in which the symmetric dynamics unfold. Everything that changes particles, forces, space-time configurations is a manifestation of the symmetries. The symmetries themselves do not change. Noether's theorem reveals that the conservation laws and the symmetries are the same thing, expressed in different languages. The conservation of energy is the temporal constancy of the laws. The conservation of momentum is the spatial constancy of the laws. And the constancy of the laws is the deepest unchanging structure in the physical world, the mathematical bedrock on which the changing, decaying, entropy-increasing physical world is built. The fourth unchanging quantity is the mathematical structure of reality itself. The physicist Max Tegmark has argued that the ultimate nature of reality is mathematical, that the physical world is not merely described by mathematics, but is mathematics. In Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis, the reason that the laws of physics are mathematical is that the laws are not laws imposed on a pre-existing physical substrate. They are the mathematical structure itself, the self-consistent, logically necessary, eternally valid mathematical relationships that constitute the fundamental nature of reality. If Tegmark is correct, then the mathematical structure of reality is not merely unchanging. It is timeless, existing outside of time altogether, not subject to the second law, not susceptible to entropy, and not destined for the heat death. The mathematical structure does not exist in time. Time exists in the mathematical structure as one dimension of the four-dimensional space-time manifold that the mathematical structure describes. The structure does not age. It does not decay. It does not change. It simply is eternally, necessarily, and without the possibility of being otherwise. The mathematician and philosopher Roger Penrose has argued for a related but distinct position, that the mathematical structures exist in a Platonic realm, a realm of abstract, eternal, mind-independent truths that the physical world embodies and that the human mind discovers through the faculty of mathematical intuition. Penrose's Platonic realm is not a physical place. It is not a dimension or a region of space-time. It is an ontological category, a mode of existence that is different from physical existence, but that is equally real and that is more fundamental than physical existence, because the physical world is structured by the mathematical truths that the Platonic realm contains. The Platonic realm is the ultimate unchanging, the realm of truths that are true regardless of whether anyone knows them, regardless of whether the physical world exists, and regardless of whether time itself exists. The mathematical truth that 2 + 2 = 4 was true before the Big Bang. It will be true after the heat death. It is true in every branch of the multiverse, in every possible universe, and in every conceivable configuration of reality. The mathematical truths are the most absolutely, the most unconditionally, and the most indestructibly unchanging entities that the human mind has ever identified. The physicist Eugene Wigner described the relationship between the mathematical structure and the physical world as the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, the mysterious, unexplained, deeply puzzling fact that the abstract, timeless structures of mathematics correspond with extraordinary precision to the concrete, temporal structures of the physical world. The correspondence is not approximate. It is exact. The equations of quantum electrodynamics predict the magnetic moment of the electron to 12 decimal places, and the prediction matches the measurement to all 12. The mathematical structure is not a model of reality. It is reality, or, at the very least, it is so intimately connected to reality that the distinction between the two is, for all practical purposes, meaningless. The picture that emerges is this. The physical world is divided into two categories: the changing and the unchanging, the decaying and the eternal, the surface and the source, The changing includes everything that the senses perceive: the bodies, the objects, the structures, the stars, the galaxies, the entire visible universe in all its complexity and all its beauty. All of this is subject to the second law. All of this is decaying. All of this is destined for the heat death. The unchanging includes the quantities that the conservation laws protect: the energy, the information, the symmetries, and the mathematical structure that the laws express. These do not decay. These are not subject to the second law. These are the constants of nature, the fixed points around which the changing world revolves, the eternals that persist while the temporals dissolve. The division between the changing surface and the unchanging source is not merely an academic classification. It is an existential confrontation. The human being exists at the intersection of the changing and the unchanging. Your body is changing, aging, decaying, approaching the equilibrium of death. Your energy is unchanging, conserved, indestructible, eternal in its total quantity. Your experiences are changing, arising, persisting briefly, and dissolving into memory. Your information is unchanging, preserved, encoded, distributed across the quantum state of the universe. And your consciousness, the awareness with which you perceive both the changing and the unchanging, is what? Changing or unchanging? Temporal or eternal? Part of the surface that decays or part of the source that remains? The answer to this question determines everything. If consciousness is part of the changing surface, if it is a product of the brain, generated by neural processes, and destroyed when the brain dies, then consciousness is subject to the second law. It arises, it persists briefly, and it dissolves. It is beautiful, complex, aware, and temporary. If consciousness is part of the unchanging source, if it is not produced by the brain but accessed by the brain, not generated by neural processes but filtered through neural processes, not a product of the temporal world but an expression of the eternal ground, then consciousness is not subject to the second law. It does not arise and it does not dissolve. It is not temporary. It is the eternal awareness that perceives the temporal world from within the unchanging source. The contemplative traditions have been describing this division for millennia. In Hinduism, the distinction between the changing and the unchanging is the distinction between Prakriti and Purusha, between nature, which changes, and consciousness, which does not. The Bhagavad Gita states, "That which pervades the entire body, know it to be indestructible. No one can cause the destruction of the imperishable. The imperishable is the Atman, the unchanging consciousness, the eternal witness, the source that remains while the physical realities it witnesses decay." The Samkhya philosophy, one of the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy, develops the Prakriti-Purusha distinction into a comprehensive cosmological system. Prakriti, nature, matter. The changing evolves through 3 gunas qualities: sattva, luminosity; rajas, activity; and tamas, inertia. The evolution of Prakriti produces the entire manifest world, the elements, the senses, the mind, the ego, and the physical universe. But Purusha consciousness, the unchanging witness, does not evolve. It does not participate in the change. It observes the change from outside the change, perceiving the evolution of Prakriti without being affected by it. The suffering of existence, in the Samkhya analysis, arises from the confusion of Purusha with Prakriti, the mistaken identification of the unchanging consciousness with the changing nature that it observes. In Buddhism, the distinction between the changing and the unchanging is the distinction between the conditioned and the unconditioned, between sankhara, the phenomena that arise dependent on conditions and that pass away when the conditions change, and Nibbana, the unconditioned reality that does not arise, does not pass away, and is not subject to the impermanence that characterizes every conditioned phenomenon. The Udana states, There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, there would be no escape from the born, the become, the made, the conditioned. The unconditioned is the source, the unchanging ground from which the changing world arises and to which it returns. In Christianity, the distinction between the changing and the unchanging is the distinction between creation and creator, between the created world, which is temporal, mutable, and subject to decay, and the creator, who is eternal, immutable, and not subject to any change. The Epistle of James states, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." The Father of lights is the source, the unchanging reality from which the changing gifts descend. In Taoism, the distinction between the changing and the unchanging is the distinction between the 10,000 things and the Tao. The 10,000 things change, they arise, they transform, they dissolve, they return to the Tao. The Tao does not change, it is the nameless, formless, inexhaustible source from which the 10,000 things emerge and to which they return. The Tao Te Ching states, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The eternal Tao is unspeakable because it is unchanging, and language, which consists of changing sounds and changing meanings, cannot capture what does not change. The eternal Tao is the source that remains, while the 10,000 things it produces decay." The physicist and Taoist scholar Fritjof Capra, in his book The Tao of Physics, identified the parallel between the Tao and the quantum vacuum. Both are the unchanging ground from which the changing phenomena arise. The vacuum fluctuates, it produces virtual particles that arise and dissolve, but the vacuum itself does not change its ground state energy, its field structure, and its quantum properties remain constant, while the fluctuations it produces come and go. The Tao is the vacuum, the 10,000 things are the fluctuations, and the relationship between them, the unchanging source producing the changing surface, is the relationship that both the physics and the tradition describe. The traditions agree with the physics. Everything changes except the source. The surface decays, the source remains, and the question that the next stage of this investigation will pursue is, what is the source? Is it merely the abstract mathematical structure that the physics describes? Or is it, as the traditions unanimously report, something more, something conscious, something alive, something that is not merely the unchanging framework of the changing world, but the aware, intelligent, creatively active ground from which the changing world continuously arises? We have established that everything in the visible world decays, that the second law of thermodynamics drives every structure, every system, and every living thing toward the dissolution of maximum entropy. And we have identified 4 quantities that do not decay: energy, quantum information, the laws of physics, and the mathematical structure that the laws express. These are the unchanging quantities, the constants that persist while the physical world around them crumbles. Now we must go deeper, because the unchanging quantities we identified in the previous stage are not merely a list of conserved numbers. They are the structure of an unchanging reality, a reality that is more fundamental than the changing physical world, that exists beneath the surface of the temporal process, and that constitutes the source from which the changing world continuously arises. The physics of the past century has progressively revealed this unchanging reality, and its features are extraordinary. The first feature of the unchanging reality is that it is timeless. In our investigation of time, we established that the block universe of general relativity describes a 4-dimensional space-time manifold in which past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. The block does not flow, it does not change, it does not evolve from a past state to a future state, it simply is complete, unchanging, and eternal. The experience of temporal flow, the sense that the present moment moves forward, leaving the past behind and approaching the future, is not a feature of the block. It is a feature of the consciousness that traverses the block, a feature produced by the sequential processing of the brain, not by any physical process in the space-time structure itself. The block universe is the unchanging reality that the temporal process conceals. The changing world, the world of birth and death, of growth and decay, of entropy increase and structural dissolution, is the sequential experience of the block's content. The block itself does not change. The block contains every moment, every configuration of the physical world at every instant of time simultaneously. The heat-death is in the block. The Big Bang is in the block, and every moment between them is in the block. The block does not undergo entropy increase, because entropy increase is a feature of the sequential traversal, not of the block itself. The block is the unchanging source. The temporal process is the changing surface, and the surface's change is the consciousness's experience of the source's unchanging content. The timelessness of the block universe has a specific, verifiable consequence. The laws of physics are the same at every moment. The constants of nature, the speed of light, Planck's constant, the gravitational constant, the fine structure constant, do not change with time. Multiple experiments have searched for time variation in the fundamental constants, using atomic clocks, quasar absorption spectra, the cosmic microwave background, and the Oklo natural nuclear reactor, a 2 billion-year-old natural reactor in Gabon, whose isotope ratios constrain the historical values of the fine structure constant. No variation has been detected. The constants are constant, unchanging over the entire age of the universe, from the first fraction of a second after the Big Bang to the present day. The constancy of the constants is not guaranteed by any known principle. It is an empirical fact, a measured, verified, repeatedly confirmed observation that the fundamental parameters of the physical world do not change with time. But the fact is consistent with the block universe. If the block is a complete, unchanging, four-dimensional structure, then the parameters that describe the structure should be the same at every temporal location within the structure. The constants are constant because the block is constant, and the block is constant because it does not exist in time. Time exists in it. The philosopher of physics Tim Maudlin has described the block universe's timelessness with precision. In the block universe, nothing happens. There are no events, no processes, no changes. There are only the four-dimensional structures, world lines, world tubes, field configurations that occupy the space-time manifold. The appearance of happening is produced by the perspective of a conscious being embedded in the block, experiencing the block's content sequentially. But the block itself does not happen, it simply is. The physicist Julian Barbour has taken this reasoning to its logical conclusion. In Barbour's timeless physics, the fundamental reality is not a space-time block that exists in time, but a configuration space, Platonia, as Barbour calls it, that contains every possible configuration of the universe, arranged not by temporal sequence, but by structural similarity. Each configuration is a now, a complete, self-contained, timeless snapshot of the universe. And the experience of time, the feeling that one now follows another, that the past gives way to the present and the present to the future, is an illusion produced by the correlations between the nows, not by any genuine temporal process. Barbour's Platonia is the ultimate unchanging reality, a timeless landscape of possible configurations that does not evolve, does not change, and does not decay. The configurations themselves are eternal, each one existing permanently in the landscape, never created and never destroyed. And the physics is the structure of the landscape, the mathematical relationships between the configurations that determine which configurations exist and how they are related to each other. Barber's Platonia connects to the Hindu concept of the Akashic field and to the Buddhist concept of the Dharmadhatu, both of which describe a timeless, complete, all-containing realm in which every possible configuration of reality is simultaneously present. The Dharmadhatu, as the Huayan school describes it, is a realm in which every phenomenon contains every other phenomenon, every moment contains every other moment, and the totality is present in each of its parts. Barber's Platonia has the same structure. Every possible now is present, every possible configuration coexists, and the totality of physical possibility is contained in a single, timeless, unchanging landscape. The Vedantic concept of Brahman as Sat Chit Ananda being consciousness bliss describes the unchanging reality as possessing three essential qualities. Sat is being pure, unconditioned, unchanging existence. Chit is consciousness pure, unconditioned, unchanging awareness. And Ananda is bliss, the unconditioned, self-sufficient, inherently satisfying quality of the unchanging existence. The changing world, in the Vedantic analysis, participates in Sat, it exists, in Chit, it is perceived, and in Ananda, it is valued, but it does so imperfectly, partially, and temporarily. The unchanging Brahman possesses Sat, Chit, and Ananda fully, completely, and eternally. The changing world is the partial, temporal, imperfect expression of the unchanging reality's complete, eternal, perfect nature. The second feature of the unchanging reality is that it is symmetric. The symmetries of the physical world, the invariances, the constancies, the properties that remain the same when the system is transformed, are the deepest expressions of the unchanging. We established in the previous stage that Noether's theorem connects every symmetry to a conservation law, but the symmetries go deeper than the conservation laws they produce. The symmetries are the structure of the unchanging reality itself, the mathematical properties of the fundamental laws that remain constant while everything that the laws describe changes. The most fundamental symmetries in physics are the gauge symmetries, the internal symmetries that determine the structure of the forces. The gauge symmetry of electromagnetism is U1, the symmetry of the complex numbers under phase rotation. The gauge symmetry of the weak force is SU2, the symmetry of the two-dimensional complex vectors under unitary transformation. And the gauge symmetry of the strong force is SU3, the symmetry of the three-dimensional complex vectors under unitary transformation. The standard model of particle physics is built on these three symmetries: U, 1 times SU, 2 times SU, 3. Every particle, every force, every interaction that the standard model describes is a consequence of these symmetries. The symmetries do not change. The particles change, they are created, they interact, they decay. The forces change, they vary in strength with energy scale. They unify at high energies. They may have been different in the early universe. The space-time changes, it expands, it curves, it fluctuates at the quantum level. But the symmetries that govern the particles, the forces, and the space-time do not change. They are the fixed framework within which the change occurs, the unchanging stage on which the changing drama is performed. The physicist Hermann Weyl, who introduced the concept of gauge symmetry into physics in 1929, described symmetries as the most fundamental concept in the physical sciences. Weyl argued that the symmetries are not properties of the physical world. They are the physical world, the mathematical structure whose specific form determines every particle, every force, and every physical law that the world contains. To know the symmetries is to know the world. And the symmetries, being unchanging, are the knowable core of a world whose surface is in constant flux. The physicist Paul Dirac elevated symmetry to a methodological principle. a physical law must possess mathematical beauty. Dirac's beauty criterion is not aesthetic indulgence. It is an empirical observation about the relationship between symmetry and truth. The most fundamental laws of physics are the most symmetric, and the most symmetric laws are the most beautiful. The beauty is the symmetry perceived by the human mind, the recognition by the consciousness that perceives the changing world of the unchanging structure that underlies it. The history of physics confirms Dirac's criterion. Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism was driven by the recognition of a symmetry between electric and magnetic fields. Einstein's general relativity was driven by the recognition of a symmetry between gravity and acceleration. Dirac's own equation for the electron was driven by the requirement that the equation be symmetric under the Lorentz transformations of special relativity, and the symmetry requirement predicted the existence of antimatter before antimatter had been observed. In each case, the pursuit of symmetry led to the discovery of a deeper truth. The symmetry was the guide, the truth was the destination, and the beauty was the sign that the guide was leading in the right direction. The physicist Steven Weinberg has described the role of symmetry in physics with a metaphor that captures its relationship to the unchanging. The symmetries of the laws of physics are like the skeleton of the world, the bones that remain when the flesh has decayed. The particles and the forces and the structures are the flesh. The symmetries are the bones, and the bones are what endure. The grand unified theories, the theoretical frameworks that attempt to unify the electromagnetic, weak and strong forces into a single force governed by a single, larger symmetry group, seek the deeper symmetry that underlies the three standard model symmetries. The most promising good candidates use the symmetry group SU5, proposed by Howard Georgi and Sheldon Glashow in 1974, or the larger groups SO10 and E6. In each case, the unification is a symmetry unification, the discovery of a single, deeper, more comprehensive symmetry, from which the three known symmetries emerge as partial, broken expressions. The quest for unification is the quest for the unchanging, the search for the single, unbroken symmetry from which all the specific, broken symmetries of the visible world emerge. If the GUT is found, it will reveal the unchanging structure that underlies the three forces, the single mathematical pattern that produces, through successive symmetry breakings, the electromagnetic force, the weak force, and the strong force that the standard model describes separately. The unification would be the discovery of the source, the mathematical source from which the three forces emerge as surface manifestations. The even deeper quest, the quest for a theory of everything that unifies the gut with gravity, would reveal the ultimate unchanging structure, the single mathematical framework from which every force, every particle, every physical law, and every feature of the physical world emerges. String theory is the most developed candidate for the theory of everything, and its central claim that the diversity of matter is the diversity of vibration of a single fundamental entity is a claim about the unchanging, one string, one entity, one source, producing through its vibrations the entire diversity of the changing world. The concept of symmetry breaking is crucial for understanding the relationship between the unchanging symmetries and the changing world. A symmetry is broken when the system's actual state does not display the symmetry that the system's laws possess. The laws of electromagnetism are symmetric between north and south. The laws do not prefer one magnetic pole over the other. But a bar magnet is not symmetric. It has a specific north pole and a specific south pole. The symmetry is present in the laws but broken in the state. The entire visible world is a broken symmetry. The laws of physics are symmetric. The actual state of the universe is not. The laws do not prefer matter over antimatter, but the universe contains matter and almost no antimatter. The laws do not prefer one direction of time over another, But the universe has a specific arrow of time pointing from low entropy to high entropy. The laws do not prefer one spatial configuration over another, but the universe has a specific spatial configuration. The cosmic web, the galaxies, the stars, the planets. Every structure in the visible world, every atom, every molecule, every organism, every galaxy is a broken symmetry, a specific, asymmetric state that the symmetric laws have produced, but that the symmetric laws do not require. The early universe, in the first fractions of a second after the Big Bang, was in a state of unbroken symmetry. The electromagnetic force and the weak force were unified. They were the same force, described by the same symmetry group, producing the same interactions. The unification was broken when the universe cooled below a critical temperature, approximately 10 to the 15 Kelvin, and the Higgs field acquired a non-zero vacuum expectation value, breaking the electroweak symmetry and giving the W and Z bosons their mass while leaving the photon massless. The symmetry breaking is a phase transition like water freezing into ice. The symmetric state transitioning into an asymmetric state as the temperature drops below the critical point. The physicist Yoichiro Nambu, who shared the Nobel Prize for the discovery of spontaneous symmetry breaking in particle physics, described the relationship between the unbroken and the broken with an analogy. A pencil balanced on its tip is symmetric. It looks the same from every direction, but the pencil is unstable. Any perturbation will cause it to fall in a specific direction, breaking the symmetry. The fallen pencil is asymmetric, it points in a specific direction, but the law that governs the pencil's fall is symmetric, it does not prefer any direction over any other. The specific direction of the fall is determined by the perturbation, not by the law. The law is symmetric, the state is not. And the universe is the fallen pencil, an asymmetric state produced by the symmetric laws through the spontaneous breaking that the cooling and the perturbations of the early universe triggered. The visible world is the broken symmetry. The unchanging reality is the unbroken symmetry. The changing surface is the specific state. The unchanging source is the law. And the relationship between them, the relationship between the symmetric law and the asymmetric state, is the relationship between the eternal and the temporal, between the source and the surface, between the unchanging ground and the changing world that the ground produces. The third feature of the unchanging reality is that it is holographic. In our investigation of the hidden layer, we established that the holographic principle describes a reality in which the three-dimensional visible world is a projection from a two-dimensional informational boundary. The boundary is the unchanging structure, the projection is the changing surface, and the relationship between them, the holographic encoding that connects the boundary's information to the bulk's geometry, is the mechanism by which the unchanging produces the changing. The holographic boundary does not change, it does not evolve, it does not undergo entropy increase. The boundary's information is complete, self-consistent, and eternally present. The temporal process that the bulk displays the birth and death of stars, the evolution of life, the entropy increase that drives the arrow of time, is the bulk's experience of the boundary's unchanging information. The boundary is the source, the bulk is the surface, and the surface's change is the projection of the source's constancy into the three-dimensional medium that the consciousness inhabits. The relationship between the unchanging boundary and the changing bulk illuminates the deepest question about the second law of thermodynamics. Why does entropy increase in the bulk? The answer, in the holographic framework, is that the entropy increase is a feature of the projection, not of the source. The boundary's information is complete and unchanging, but the bulk's projection of the boundary's information is partial and sequential. The three-dimensional world perceives the two-dimensional information one slice at a time, in temporal sequence, and the sequential perception produces the appearance of entropy increase. The entropy is not increasing on the boundary. It is increasing in the bulk's perception of the boundary in the way that the three-dimensional world experiences the two-dimensional information. The physicist Leonard Susskind has described this with a specific analogy. Imagine a book. The book contains a complete, unchanging, self-consistent story. The story does not change. The characters are born, they live, they die, but the book does not change. The birth and the death are both present in the book, simultaneously, on different pages. The reader experiences the story sequentially, page by page, chapter by chapter, and the sequential experience produces the feeling of change, of development, of entropy increase. But the book is unchanging. The change is in the reading, not in the book. The block universe is the book. The holographic boundary is the text. And the conscious experience of temporal flow is the reading, the sequential perception of an unchanging story that produces the appearance of change, of development, and of entropic dissolution. The physicist Juan Maldaceno's ADS CFT correspondence demonstrates this with mathematical rigor. The boundary theory, the conformal field theory that lives on the two-dimensional surface, is mathematically equivalent to the bulk theory, the gravitational theory that lives in the three-dimensional interior. The equivalence means that every process in the bulk, every gravitational interaction, every particle collision, every entropy increasing event corresponds to a process on the boundary. But the boundary process does not involve gravity, does not involve entropy increase, and does not involve temporal change in the same way that the bulk process does. The boundary is the timeless, gravity-free, entropy-invariant description of the same reality that the bulk describes in temporal, gravitational, entropy-increasing terms. The unchanging reality is the boundary. The changing reality is the bulk. And the physics of the boundary, the conformal field theory, the quantum information, the entanglement structure, is the physics of the source, the unchanging, timeless, entropy-free description of the reality that the temporal, gravitational, entropy-increasing bulk expresses. The fourth feature of the unchanging reality is that it may be conscious. We established in our investigation of the hidden layer that every contemplative tradition describes the unchanging source as conscious, as aware, as knowing, as experientially present. The Vedantic Brahman is consciousness. The Buddhist unconditioned is luminous awareness. The Christian creator is a conscious, personal God. And the Taoist Tao, while not personal, is described as the creative, responsive, spontaneously active source from which the 10,000 things arise. The physicist Roger Penrose has argued that consciousness is connected to the unchanging mathematical structure of reality through the objective reduction of quantum states. In the Ocho model, the conscious experience is produced by the collapse of quantum superpositions in the brain's microtubules, a collapse that is triggered by the gravitational self-energy of the superposition, and that involves the Planck scale geometry of space-time. The Planck scale geometry is the deepest physical structure, the most fundamental level of the physical world, the level at which the quantum and the gravitational descriptions merge. And the conscious experience is connected to this deepest level, rooted in the unchanging mathematical structure that the Planck scale geometry expresses. If Penrose is correct, then consciousness is not a surface phenomenon. It is a source phenomenon, rooted in the unchanging mathematical structure, connected to the Planck scale geometry, and produced by the interaction between the temporal process of the brain and the timeless structure of the mathematical reality. The consciousness that you experience right now is not merely a product of the changing brain. It is the unchanging source's awareness of the changing world, the timeless mathematical structure's perception of the temporal process that it produces. The connection between consciousness and the unchanging mathematical structure has been explored by the mathematician and philosopher Alain Connes, who has developed a mathematical framework non-commutative geometry that describes the structure of space-time at the Planck scale. Conners's framework suggests that the Planck scale geometry is not a smooth, continuous manifold, but a discrete algebraic structure whose properties are determined by the non-commutative algebra that describes it. The algebra is the unchanging structure. The space-time that the algebra generates is the changing surface. And the conscious experience that Penrose's objective reduction produces is the point of contact between the unchanging algebra and the changing space-time, the moment at which the eternal mathematical structure touches the temporal physical process and produces the specific, qualitative, irreducible experience of being aware. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead anticipated this connection in his process philosophy. Whitehead described each moment of conscious experience as a concrescence, a growing together of the eternal mathematical forms, which Whitehead called eternal objects, and the temporal physical process, which Whitehead called actual occasions. The conscious moment is the intersection of the eternal and the temporal, the point at which the unchanging source and the changing surface meet, and the meeting is experienced as awareness. The integrated information theory of Giulio Tononi supports this from a different direction. If consciousness is identical to integrated information phi, and if phi is a fundamental property of physical systems rather than an emergent property of biological brains, then consciousness is as fundamental as energy, as fundamental as information, and as fundamental as the mathematical structure that the laws express. Consciousness does not arise from the changing surface. It is part of the unchanging source, a fundamental feature of the reality that produces the changing world, not a product of the changing world that the reality produces. The picture is now complete. The unchanging reality has four features. It is timeless, the block universe, Barber's Platonia. It is symmetric, the gauge symmetries, the unbroken laws. It is holographic, the boundaries unchanging information, and it may be conscious, Penrose's Planck scale connection, Tononi's fundamental phi. These four features describe a reality that is more fundamental than the changing physical world, a reality that the changing world expresses, but that the changing world does not exhaust. The four features of the unchanging reality are not independent. They are interconnected aspects of a single, unified, unchanging structure that the different physics disciplines describe from different perspectives. The timelessness is the block universe's temporal completeness. The symmetry is the block universe's structural constancy. The holographic encoding is the block universe's informational compression. And the consciousness may be the block universe's self-awareness, the mathematical structure perceiving itself through the biological instruments that it produces within the temporal projection. The physicist John Wheeler's concept of the self-excited circuit captures the relationship between the four features. The universe is a circuit that brings itself into existence through its own observation. The unchanging mathematical structure, the circuit's design, produces the temporal physical process, the circuit's operation, which produces consciousness, the circuit's self-awareness, which observes the mathematical structure, completing the circuit. The circuit is self-referential, the source observes the surface, and the surface, through its observation, participates in the source. The unchanging and the changing are not separate realities. They are aspects of a single, self-referential, self-aware, self-sustaining process that the word universe inadequately names. The contemplative traditions have been describing this reality for millennia. They call it Brahman, they call it Nibbana, they call it the Logos, they call it the Tao, they call it the ground of being, the clear light, the Ein Sof, the Dharmakaya. The names are different. The descriptions are different. The practices for perceiving it are different. But the reality they describe has the same four features that the physics identifies. It is timeless, it is symmetric, it is holographic, and it is conscious. The convergence between the physics and the traditions is not coincidental. Both are investigating the same reality, the unchanging source beneath the changing surface. The physics investigates through mathematics, experiment, and logical deduction. The traditions investigate through contemplative practice, direct perception, and experiential report. The methods are different, the languages are different, but the target is the same. The timeless, symmetric, holographic, possibly conscious ground from which the temporal, asymmetric, three-dimensional, certainly changing world arises. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who collaborated with Carl Jung on the relationship between physics and the unconscious, described the convergence as evidence that the physical and the psychical are aspects of a single reality, that the unchanging source discovered by physics and the unchanging ground perceived by the contemplatives are not two different things but one thing, perceived from two different perspectives. The physicist perceives the source through its mathematical structure, the contemplative perceives the source through its conscious quality, and both perceptions are valid, both are partial, and both point to a reality that transcends both, a reality that is simultaneously mathematical and conscious, simultaneously structured and aware, simultaneously the timeless equations of the physicist and the timeless awareness of the mystic. In the next stage, we will examine each tradition's description of the unchanging source, in detail the specific ways that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity describe the source's nature, the source's relationship to the changing world, and the practice by which the human consciousness can perceive the source directly. We have established that the physics identifies an unchanging reality beneath the changing surface, a reality that is timeless, symmetric, holographic, and possibly conscious. The energy is conserved, the information is conserved, the symmetries are constant, the mathematical structure is eternal, and the holographic boundary encodes the unchanging information from which the changing three-dimensional world is projected. But the physics describes the unchanging reality from the outside through equations, measurements, and logical deductions. The physics can tell us the structure of the source. It cannot tell us the nature of the source. It cannot tell us what the source feels like, what the source looks like from within, or what it is like to perceive the unchanging reality directly rather than through the mediation of mathematics. The contemplative traditions can. Because the traditions have been investigating the unchanging reality from the inside through the instrument of trained consciousness, through the specific practices that reduce the changing surface's noise and reveal the unchanging source's signal, and through the millennia of experiential investigation that have produced a body of phenomenological data about the source's nature that the physics alone cannot provide. We will begin with Hinduism, which provides the most comprehensive, the most philosophically rigorous, and the most experientially detailed account of the unchanging source. The Hindu name for the unchanging source is Brahman, the infinite, formless, attributeless, self-existent ground of all being. Brahman is not a god in the Western sense, not a person, not a creator who is separate from the creation, not an entity who acts upon the world from outside. Brahman is the world, the substance, the ground, the being of which every phenomenon is a manifestation. The Chandogya Upanishad declares, all this is Brahman. Not that Brahman created all this, not that Brahman pervades all this is Brahman. The changing world is Brahman, Brahman appearing as the changing world, Brahman manifesting in the temporal forms that the second law dissolves. Brahman playing the game of change while remaining, in its deepest nature, unchanged. The Upanishadic description of Brahman maps onto the physics description of the unchanging reality with remarkable precision. Brahman is Sat being, existence, the pure fact of existing that does not depend on any specific form, and that persists when every form has dissolved. The conservation of energy is the physical expression of Sat. The total being, the total energy is conserved, regardless of the forms that the energy takes. Brahman is chit consciousness, awareness, the knowing quality that perceives every form and that is not itself a form. The consciousness that the Orchor model connects to the Planck scale structure is the physical expression of chit, awareness rooted in the unchanging mathematical structure, not produced by the changing surface. And Brahman is Ananda bliss, the self-sufficient, inherently satisfying quality that the source possesses and that the changing world participates in imperfectly. The aesthetic satisfaction that physicists describe when they encounter the beauty of the laws, the beauty that Dirac elevated to a methodological principle, is the scientific expression of Ananda, the bliss of the unchanging perceived through its mathematical structure. The sage Shankara's analysis of the relationship between Brahman and the world is the most philosophically precise account of the relationship between the unchanging source and the changing surface in any tradition. Shankara identifies 3 levels of reality. The highest is Paramarthika, the ultimate reality, which is Brahman alone, unchanging, formless, and self-identical. The middle is Vyavaharika, the conventional reality, the world of objects, persons, and events that the waking consciousness perceives. And the lowest is Pratibhasika, the apparent reality, the world of dreams, illusions, and misperceptions that even the conventional reality reveals as unreal. The relationship between Paramarthika and Vyavaharika is the relationship between the source and the surface. The source is real. The surface is real in a derivative, dependent, secondary sense. Real as a projection is real. Real as a hologram is real. Real as a wave on the ocean is real. The wave is not unreal. It has structure. It carries energy. It produces effects. But the wave is not independently real. It depends on the ocean. It arises from the ocean, and it returns to the ocean. The ocean does not depend on the wave. The ocean is the source. The wave is the surface. And Shankara's 3-level ontology is the philosophical expression of the holographic principle. The boundary, Paramarthika, is the fundamental reality. The bulk Vyavaharika is the derived reality. And the misperceptions of the bulk Pratibhasika are the errors that the derived reality's incompleteness produces. Shankara's 3-level ontology has a specific practical implication. The suffering that the changing world produces is caused by the confusion of levels, by the mistaken identification of Paramarthika with Vyavaharika, by the belief that the changing surface is the fundamental reality and that the unchanging source is an abstraction, a philosophy, or a distant goal. The spiritual practice is the correction of this confusion, the progressive recognition that the surface is derivative and the source is fundamental, that the changing is dependent and the unchanging is self-existent, and that the self's deepest identity belongs to the unchanging source, not to the changing surface. The Kena Upanishad describes the relationship between the source and the perceiver with an image of extraordinary precision, that which cannot be seen by the eye, but by which the eye is able to see, know that alone as Brahman, not what people worship as an object. Brahman is not an object that the consciousness perceives. Brahman is the consciousness that perceives objects. The eye cannot see itself. The consciousness cannot objectify itself. And the attempt to perceive Brahman as an object, the attempt to find the source as a thing among things, is the fundamental error that the spiritual practice corrects. The source is not found by looking outward at the objects of the world. The source is found by recognizing the looker, the unchanging awareness that was present before every object appeared and that will persist after every object has dissolved. The practice for perceiving Brahman directly is Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the systematic investigation of the nature of the self through the method of neti, not this, not this. The practitioner examines every candidate for the unchanging self, the body changing, therefore not the self, the thoughts changing, therefore not the self, the emotions changing, therefore not the self, the memories changing, therefore not the self, and rejects each one as changing, temporal and surface. What remains after every changing candidate has been rejected is the unchanging awareness that was performing the rejection, the pure consciousness that perceives every change, and that does not itself change. This awareness is the Atman, the individual self, and the Atman, Shankara declares, is Brahman. The unchanging awareness that you discover at the core of your own experience is identical to the unchanging source from which the entire universe arises. The 20th century sage Ramana Maharshi described the experience of perceiving Brahman with a directness that strips away the philosophical apparatus. The world is not separate from you. You are the world. The world is not separate from Brahman. Brahman is the world. You are Brahman. This is not a conclusion. It is a perception as direct, as immediate, and as undeniable as the perception of the light in this room. Ramana's statement is not a philosophical argument. It is an experiential report, the report of a consciousness that has perceived the unchanging source directly, and that describes the perception as simple, obvious, and immediately available to anyone who undertakes the practice. The sage Nisargadatta Maharaj described the unchanging with an intimacy that dissolves the philosophical distance. You are not in the world is in you. You are not the body is in you. You are not the mind is in you. What you are is the awareness in which the body, the mind, and the world appear, and that awareness does not change when they change, does not suffer when they suffer, and does not die when they die. The Kashmir Shaivism tradition adds a dynamic dimension to the Vedantic understanding of the source. While Shankara's Advaita describes Brahman as the unchanging witness passive, uninvolved, merely observing the changing world, Kashmir Shaivism describes the source as Shiva Shakti, the inseparable union of the unchanging awareness, Shiva, and the creative energy that produces the changing world, Shakti. The source is not passive. The source is creative, actively, joyfully, spontaneously, producing the changing world as its own self-expression. The changing world is not Maya in the sense of a cosmic mistake. It is Lila divine play, the source's creative self-expression, the unchanging awareness's joyful manifestation in the changing forms of the temporal world. The philosopher Abhinavagupta, the great systematizer of Kashmir Shaivism, described the relationship between the unchanging and the changing as the relationship between the dancer and the dance. The dancer does not change, the dancer's identity remains the same throughout the performance, but the dance changes the movements, the gestures, the expressions shift and transform from moment to moment. The dance is the dancer's self-expression, the dancer making visible, through the changing movements, the unchanging creative intention that animates the performance. The universe is Shiva's dance, the unchanging consciousness expressing itself through the changing forms of the physical world, creating and destroying, arising and dissolving, playing the cosmic game of manifestation while remaining, in its deepest nature, unchanged. The Bhagavad Gita provides the ethical and practical framework. Krishna tells Arjuna, "Whatever is born must die. Whatever dies must be reborn. Therefore, do not grieve for the inevitable." The statement is not fatalism. It is the source's perspective on the surface's change. From the surface's perspective, death is loss. From the source's perspective, death is transformation, the changing surface rearranging itself, while the unchanging source continues, unaffected, undiminished, and unaltered by the surface's dissolution. The Gita's counsel is, identify with the source, not with the surface. Identify with the unchanging, not with the changing. And act in the world, perform your dharma, fulfill your obligations, engage with the changing surface, but act from the perspective of the source, knowing that the source is what you truly are, and that the surface is what you temporarily inhabit. In Buddhism, the unchanging source takes a different philosophical form, but produces the same experiential outcome. The Buddhist tradition does not posit a Brahman, an eternal, positive, self-existent ground of being. The Buddhist tradition posits Nibbana, the unconditioned, the unborn, the unmade, the cessation of the conditioned processes that constitute the changing world. Nibbana is not a thing. It is not a place. It is not a state that the consciousness enters and occupies. It is the absence of the conditioned, the absence of the arising and passing away, the absence of the birth and death, the absence of the change, and the decay that the second law prescribes for everything in the conditioned world. But the absence of the conditioned is not nothing. It is the unconditioned, the reality that remains when every conditioned phenomenon has been seen through, released, and allowed to dissolve. The Udana's declaration, "There is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned," is not a statement about nothing. It is a statement about the unchanging, the reality that does not arise because it was never absent, that does not pass away because it cannot be diminished, and that does not depend on conditions because it is the ground from which all conditions arise. The practice for perceiving Nibbana is the systematic development of Vipassana insight meditation, the direct observation of the changing phenomena of body and mind. The practitioner observes the arising and passing away of every sensation, every thought, every emotion, noting the impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness, and the non-self quality of every conditioned phenomenon. Through sustained observation, the practitioner sees directly that every phenomenon is impermanent, anicca, that every phenomenon is unsatisfactory as a basis for lasting happiness, dukkha, and that every phenomenon is devoid of a permanent, unchanging self, anatta. The seeing of the three characteristics is not an intellectual conclusion. It is a direct perception, a perception that arises from the sustained, moment-by-moment observation of the changing phenomena and that produces, progressively, the disenchantment with the changing surface and the opening to the unchanging source. The practitioner does not seek Nibbana. The practitioner sees through the conditioned, and Nibbana is what remains when the conditioned has been seen through. The seeing is the practice. The remaining is the result. And the result is liberation, the freedom from the suffering that the attachment to the condition produces. The Theravada master, Ajahn Chah, described the practice with his characteristic directness. If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. The letting go is the release of the attachment to the changing surface. The peace is the perception of the unchanging source, and the completeness of the peace is proportional to the completeness of the release, because the source's peace is always there, always available, always complete. It is only the attachment to the surface that prevents the peace from being perceived. The relationship between Nibbana and the conditioned world is described by the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna with a paradox that has puzzled and illuminated practitioners for 2 millennia. There is not the slightest difference between samsara and Nibbana. Samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The world of change and decay is not separate from Nibbana, the unconditioned, the unchanging, the source. They are the same reality perceived from different perspectives. Samsara is the surface, Nibbana is the source. And the surface and the source are not 2 different realities, but one reality perceived in 2 modes. The mode of ignorance, which sees only the surface and suffers from its impermanence, and the mode of wisdom, which sees through the surface to the source and is liberated from the suffering that impermanence produces. Nagarjuna's equation of samsara and Nibbana is the Buddhist expression of the holographic principle. the bulk samsara, the changing three-dimensional world, and the boundary Nibbana, the unchanging informational ground, are the same reality described in different languages. The bulk description includes time, change, entropy, and decay. The boundary description does not. And the Buddhist practice, the Eightfold Path, the meditation, the wisdom that sees through the conventional to the ultimate, is the progressive shift from the bulk description to the boundary description, from the surface's perspective to the source's perspective. The Dzogchen tradition of Tibetan Buddhism describes the unchanging source as Rigpa, the non-dual, naturally luminous, intrinsically aware nature of mind. Rigpa is not something that the practitioner creates. It is not something that the practitioner achieves. It is something that the practitioner recognizes, the unchanging awareness that has always been present, that has never been affected by the changing content of experience, and that the changing content has been concealing through its constant attention-capturing, consciousness-filling activity. The Dzogchen master Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche described the recognition of Rigpa with an image that captures the relationship between the unchanging and the changing. The nature of mind is like the sky. Thoughts and emotions are like clouds. The clouds arise in the sky, the clouds dissolve in the sky, but the sky is never stained by the clouds. The sky does not become cloudy when clouds appear. The sky does not become clear when clouds dissolve. The sky is always clear. The sky is always present. The sky is always unchanged. The sky is the source. The clouds are the surface. And the practice of Dzogchen is the recognition that you are the sky, not the clouds, that your deepest identity is the unchanging awareness, not the changing thoughts and emotions that arise and dissolve within it. The Dzogchen tradition emphasizes that the recognition of Rigpa is not an achievement. It is not the product of years of effort, of accumulated merit, or of progressive spiritual development. It is a recognition, an immediate, direct, instantaneous seeing of what has always been the case. The Rigpa was never absent. It was never created by the practice. It was never hidden by the clouds. It was present through every cloud, present as the space in which the cloud arose, present as the awareness in which the thought occurred, present as the unchanging in which the changing changed. The practice of Dzogchen is not the creation of Rigpa. It is the recognition of Rigpa, the moment when the sky recognizes itself as the sky and stops identifying with the clouds. The Mahamudra tradition of the Kagyu lineage describes the same recognition through a different practice. The Mahamudra practitioner meditates on the nature of mind, directly sitting in stillness, observing the thoughts arise and dissolve, and recognizing that the awareness in which the thoughts arise and dissolve does not itself arise or dissolve. The thoughts are the changing. The awareness is the unchanging. And the recognition of the awareness as the unchanging, the direct, non-conceptual, experientially immediate perception that the awareness does not participate in the change that it perceives is the Mahamudra realization. The Japanese Zen master Dogen added a temporal dimension to the Buddhist understanding of the unchanging. Dogen's concept of uji being time, which we have encountered in multiple investigations, describes each moment as containing the entirety of time. The present moment is not a thin, fleeting, rapidly passing instant. It is the complete temporal structure of reality, perceived from a specific perspective. The moment contains the past. The moment contains the future. And the moment contains the unchanging, the source that is present in every moment, that does not change from moment to moment, and that constitutes the depth of the moment that the surface's rapid passing conceals. The Zen approach to the unchanging is distinctive in its radicality. Zen does not describe the unchanging through philosophy, through analysis, or through systematic meditation on the three characteristics. Zen points to the unchanging directly through the koan, the direct encounter, the sudden perception that cuts through the conceptual mind and reveals the unchanging awareness in a single, devastating flash. The koan. What is your original face before your parents were born? Is a direct pointing to the unchanging. The original face is not the face that genetics produced. It is not the face that time has aged. It is the unchanging awareness that was present before the body was born and that will persist after the body dies, the face that does not change, that was never born, and that cannot die. The koan is not asking for a philosophical answer. It is asking for a direct perception, the perception of the unchanging awareness that is, right now, reading these words, and that has been present, unchanged, through every experience of your life. The Zen master Huang Po described the unchanging with a simplicity that obliterates the philosophical complexity. All the Buddhas and all sentient beings are nothing but the one mind, beside which nothing exists. This mind, which is without beginning, is unborn and indestructible. The one mind is the unchanging. It is unborn. It was never created, never produced, never brought into existence by any cause. It is indestructible. It cannot be destroyed, cannot be diminished, cannot be affected by any change in the conditioned world, and it is all that exists beside it. Nothing exists, because every phenomenon in the changing world is a manifestation of the unchanging mind, a wave on the ocean of the one mind that does not add to the ocean and does not subtract from it. In Christianity, the unchanging source is described in the language of the eternal God, the Creator, who exists outside of time, who does not change, and who sustains the created world through the continuous creative act that the theology calls providence. The foundational statement of the unchanging in the Christian tradition is God's self-identification in the book of Exodus. I am who I am. Exodus 3:14. The divine name is not a description. It is an affirmation of pure being of existence that does not depend on anything, that does not change, and that is identical to itself at every moment. The God of the Christian tradition is not a being that happens to be unchanging. God is being the pure, unconditioned, self-sufficient act of existing, from which every other being derives its existence. The theologian Thomas Aquinas developed this into the most rigorous philosophical analysis of the unchanging in the Western tradition. Aquinas argued that God is actus purus, pure act, pure actuality, with no potentiality, no unrealized capacity, no possibility of change. Everything that God can be, God is. Everything that God can know, God knows. Everything that God can do, God does. There is no gap between the potential and the actual in God, and therefore there is no change, because change is the transition from potential to actual. And in God, there is no potential that has not already been actualized. The concept of divine immutability, God's absolute unchangingness, has been central to Christian theology since the patristic period. The Church Father Gregory of Nyssa described God as beyond all change, all alteration, all movement, existing in an eternal present that does not flow, that does not develop, and that does not undergo any transition from one state to another. The divine eternity is not endless duration, not an infinite amount of time. It is timelessness, the complete absence of temporal succession, the absolute simultaneity of all moments in the divine perspective. The Christian mystical tradition describes the experience of perceiving the divine unchangingness directly. Meister Eckhart described the experience as the perception of the eternal now, the moment in which the temporal process ceases and the consciousness perceives the divine eternity directly. The now in which God created the world is as near to this time as the now in which I am speaking, and the last day is as near to this now as yesterday. Eckhart's eternal now is the block universe's simultaneous existence of all moments, perceived from within the direct experience of the timelessness that the physics describes in mathematical terms. The Spanish mystic John of the Cross described the approach to the unchanging through the metaphor of the dark night of the soul, the period of spiritual desolation in which every attachment to the changing surface is systematically stripped away by the divine action. The dark night is not a punishment. It is a purification, the removal, by the unchanging source itself, of every attachment that prevents the consciousness from perceiving the source directly. The attachments are the clouds that obscure the sky. The dark night is the storm that clears the clouds. And the dawn that follows the dark night is the direct perception of the unchanging, the mystical union in which the consciousness perceives God as the eternal, unchanging, all-encompassing reality that was always present, but that the attachments had concealed. The 20th century Trappist monk Thomas Merton described the perception of the unchanging in terms that bridge the Christian and the Eastern. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God. This little point of nothingness is the pure glory of God in us. Merton's point of nothingness is the unchanging, the dimension of the self that does not change, that is not affected by the surface's sin and illusion, and that belongs entirely to the unchanging source. The point is nothingness because it has no specific content. It is not a thought, not an emotion, not a memory, not a perception. It is the awareness in which all these contents arise and dissolve, and the awareness does not change when the contents change. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing described the practice for perceiving the unchanging with characteristic directness. Forget all creatures and all their works, and all yourself and your works too. Let your soul be naked in the darkness of this cloud of unknowing. Think of nothing but God Himself. God is beyond all thought, all concept, all image. God is the naked being that your naked awareness perceives when every thought has been set aside. The cloud author's practice is the Christian equivalent of Shankara's neti neti, the systematic stripping away of every changing content until the unchanging awareness alone remains. The Hindu practice strips away the changing to reveal the Atman. The Christian practice strips away the changing to reveal God. And the experience that both practices produce is the same: the direct perception of the unchanging source that the changing surface conceals. The convergence across the traditions is now complete. Hinduism says, the unchanging source is Brahman being consciousness bliss, perceived through Jnana Yoga and recognized as identical to the self. Buddhism says, the unchanging source is the unconditioned Nibbana, Rigpa, the luminous awareness that is always present and that the changing content conceals. Christianity says, the unchanging source is God, pure act, eternal now, perceived through the contemplative stripping away of every changing content. Each tradition uses different language, each tradition employs different practices, but each tradition describes the same experience: the perception of an unchanging reality beneath the changing surface, a reality that is timeless, aware, and identical to the deepest dimension of the perceiver's own consciousness. The traditions also agree on what the perception of the unchanging source produces: liberation. The Hindu who perceives Brahman is liberated from the suffering of impermanence, knowing that the changing surface is not the self, and that the unchanging source, which is the self, is not subject to the decay that the surface undergoes. The Buddhist who recognizes Rigpa is liberated from the attachment to conditioned phenomena, knowing that the changing phenomena are empty of inherent existence, and that the unconditioned source is the reality that the phenomena conceal. And the Christian who perceives the eternal now is liberated from the fear of death, knowing that the divine eternity that they have glimpsed is the reality to which they belong, and that the temporal process that will end in death is the surface, not the depth, of their existence. In the final stage, we will bring everything together: the physics of entropy and conservation, the mathematics of symmetry and invariance, the holographic principle, and the contemplative tradition's experiential testimony, and ask what the unchanging source means for you, for a being who inhabits the changing surface, who is subject to the second law, who will die, and who carries within the deepest dimension of consciousness the unchanging awareness that the surface conceals and that the contemplative traditions say is your truest identity. We have now assembled the complete argument. The physics has established that everything in the visible world decays, that the second law of thermodynamics drives every structure toward dissolution, and every system toward the featureless equilibrium of maximum entropy. But the physics has also established that beneath the decaying surface there is an unchanging reality, conserved energy, conserved information, constant symmetries, eternal mathematical structure, and a timeless holographic boundary from which the changing three-dimensional world is projected. The contemplative traditions have described the same unchanging reality through millennia of experiential investigation. Brahman, Nibbana, the Logos, the Tao, and have provided specific practices for perceiving it directly. Jnana Yoga, Vipassana, contemplative prayer, Dzogchen, and the systematic stripping away of the changing surface to reveal the unchanging source beneath. Now we must bring everything together and ask the question that this investigation has been building toward. What is the source? What does the unchanging reality mean for the changing world that you inhabit? And what does it mean for you, for a being who lives on the decaying surface, who is subject to the second law, who will die, and who carries, in the deepest dimension of consciousness, the unchanging awareness that every tradition identifies as the source itself? Let us begin with what the unchanging source means for the changing world. The changing world is not separate from the source. This is the most important implication of the investigation, and it must be stated with full clarity. The changing and the unchanging are not two different realities occupying two different locations. They are two aspects of the same reality, perceived from two different perspectives. The block universe contains both the temporal process and the timeless structure. The holographic principle describes both the changing bulk and the unchanging boundary as mathematically equivalent descriptions of the same reality. And every contemplative tradition insists, with varying degrees of emphasis, that the source and the surface are not separate. Shankara's all this is Brahman, Nagarjuna's samsara is Nibbana, Eckhart's God is in all things. The relationship is not containment. The source does not contain the surface the way a box contains objects. The relationship is expression. The surface is the source expressing itself, manifesting itself, projecting itself into the temporal, spatial, gravitational forms that the visible world displays. The ocean does not contain the waves. The ocean expresses itself as waves. The waves are the ocean doing what oceans do, moving, oscillating, creating and destroying patterns on its surface while remaining, in its depths, unchanged. The physicist David Bohm described this relationship with his concept of the implicate and explicate orders. The implicate order is the source, the enfolded, hidden, unchanging totality, from which the explicate order, the unfolded, visible, changing surface, arises as a temporary, localized expression. The implicate order does not change when the explicate order changes. The source does not age when the surface ages. And the dissolution of a specific explicate form, the death of a body, the collapse of a star, the decay of a structure, is the return of the explicate to the implicate, the refolding of the surface back into the source, the wave dissolving back into the ocean from which it arose. The relationship between the source and the surface is not creation followed by abandonment. It is continuous expression, the source continuously projecting the surface. the way a fountain continuously projects the water that falls back into the pool and is projected again. The fountain does not create the water once and then leave it to fall. The fountain continuously projects the water, and the water continuously returns to the pool, and the cycle of projection and return is the ongoing creative activity that constitutes the visible world. The source is the pool, the surface is the water in the air. And the second law governs the water's return to the pool, the trajectory of the projection, the arc of the water's flight, the inevitable return of every projected form to the source from which it was projected. The second law of thermodynamics governs the surface. It does not govern the source. The entropy of the visible world increases. The entropy of the holographic boundary does not. The structures of the visible world decay. The mathematical structures of the laws do not. The bodies of the visible world age and die. The energy and the information that constitute the bodies are conserved. The second law is a law of the surface, not a law of the source. And the suffering that the second law produces, the grief of loss, the fear of death, the anguish of impermanence, is the surface's suffering, not the source's suffering. The source does not grieve. The source does not fear. The source does not suffer from impermanence because the source is not impermanent. The source is the unchanging ground from which the impermanent surface arises and to which it returns. This does not mean that the suffering is not real. The suffering is real. The grief is real. The loss is real. The fear is real. But the suffering is real the way a wave's turbulence is real, real within the wave, real for the surface, real for the consciousness that identifies with the surface and that experiences the surface's impermanence as its own impermanence. The suffering ceases when the identification shifts, when the consciousness that identified with the wave recognizes that it is the ocean, that the waves arising and dissolving is the ocean's activity, and that the ocean is not diminished by the wave's dissolution. The contemplative traditions describe this shift of identification as the essential spiritual transformation. The Hindu tradition calls it moksha, liberation from the identification with the changing surface and the recognition of identity with the unchanging source. The Buddhist tradition calls it Nibbana, the cessation of the attachment to the conditioned and the recognition of the unconditioned. The Christian tradition calls it theosis, the union of the human consciousness with the divine consciousness, the participation of the temporal in the eternal. Each tradition's name is different. Each tradition's practice is different. But the transformation is the same, the shift from identifying with the surface that decays to identifying with the source that does not. The transformation does not require the rejection of the surface. The surface is not an enemy. The surface is the source's expression, the source's creative activity, the source's self-manifestation in temporal forms. The traditions do not counsel the rejection of the world. They counsel the correct understanding of the world, the recognition that the world is the source's expression, that the world's impermanence is the expression's natural character, and that the suffering of impermanence arises not from the impermanence itself, but from the mistaken identification with the impermanent. The Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh described this with characteristic clarity. No mud, no lotus. The lotus, the symbol of spiritual awakening, grows in the mud. The mud is the surface, the changing, impermanent, suffering-producing world of conditioned phenomena. The lotus is the recognition, the perception of the unchanging source within the changing surface, the discovery of the eternal within the temporal. The lotus does not reject the mud. The lotus transforms the mud using the nutrients of the muddy water to produce the flower's beauty. The spiritual practice does not reject the surface. The spiritual practice transforms the surface using the energy of the changing world to fuel the perception of the unchanging source. The physicist and contemplative Fritjof Capra described this non-rejection with precision. The mystic does not escape the world. The mystic sees through the world, perceiving, in the dance of impermanent forms, the eternal dancer that the forms express. The seeing through is not the rejection of the forms. It is the perception of the dancer, the unchanging source that the changing forms express and that the changing forms, in their beauty and their impermanence, reveal. Now let us consider what the unchanging source means for death. Death is the surface's most dramatic event. The body's organization collapses. The brain's neural activity ceases. The personality dissolves. The memories fade. Everything that constituted the person's identity on the surface, the name, the face, the history, the relationships, the specific configuration of matter and energy that was this specific person, is returned to the environment, recycled into other forms, and absorbed into the entropy increasing flow of the second law. But the source's quantities are not affected by death. The energy is conserved, redistributed, not destroyed. The information is conserved, dispersed, not erased. The mathematical structure of the laws that govern the person's atoms, the person's chemistry, and the person's biology is unchanged. The same laws that will govern the atoms when they are incorporated into other structures, other organisms, other lives. And the consciousness, if the contemplative traditions are correct, if the consciousness is the source's awareness rather than the surface's product, is unchanged. The unchanging awareness that perceived the person's life from within continues to perceive, from the source's perspective, the continuing process of the changing world. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger described death in the light of the unchanging source with his characteristic precision. The total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings. If Schrödinger is correct, then death is not the destruction of a mind. It is the dissolution of one phasing of the single consciousness, one local, specific, biologically mediated expression of the universal awareness that continues, unchanged, through every phasing and every dissolution. The mind does not die because the mind was never born. The specific phasing, the specific person, the specific life, the specific set of experiences arose, persisted, and dissolved. But the consciousness in which the phasing occurred was never created by the phasing and is not destroyed by its dissolution. The Katha Upanishad expresses the same insight with the authority of 3 millennia of contemplative investigation. The self is never born, nor does it ever die. It does not spring into existence, having not existed before. It is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. The statement is not a consolation offered to the grieving. It is a report from the perspective of the source, describing what the source perceives when the surface's phasing dissolves. The source perceives that nothing has been lost. The energy is conserved. The information is conserved. The consciousness is unchanged. And the specific person, the specific wave on the ocean of the source, has returned to the ocean from which it arose, carrying its information, its energy, and its karmic pattern back into the depths from which a new wave will, in time, emerge. The Christian tradition describes the same insight through the concept of eternal life. Eternal life, in the Christian framework, is not the indefinite extension of temporal existence, not living forever in the temporal sense, not an infinite quantity of surface time. Eternal life is the participation of the temporal consciousness in the eternal source, the sharing by the finite self in the infinite life of the divine. The theologian Paul Tillich described eternal life as the elevation of the temporal into the eternal. Not the continuation of time, but the transcendence of time, the perception of the eternal present that the temporal flow conceals. The Buddhist tradition describes it through the concept of the deathless amata, which is one of the canonical epithets of Nibbana. The deathless is not the immortality of the body or the personality. It is the recognition that the unconditioned, the unchanging awareness that perceives the body and the personality was never born and therefore cannot die. The deathless is not a future state that the practitioner will enter after death. It is a present reality that the practitioner can recognize right now, the recognition that the awareness in which death will occur is itself deathless, because it was never born, never conditioned, and never subject to the arising and passing away that characterizes every conditioned phenomenon. The physicist Freeman Dyson expressed the same insight from the scientific perspective. It is remarkable that mind enters into our awareness of nature on two levels. At the highest level, the level of human consciousness, our minds are somehow combatant against the forces of entropy. At the deepest level, the level of physics, the mind appears to be inherent in every electron and every bit of matter in the universe. The mind at the deepest level is the source's awareness. The mind at the highest level is the surface's expression of the source's awareness. And the combat against entropy, the human mind's capacity to create, to organize, to produce structure in a universe that is dissolving toward disorder, is the source's activity expressed through the surface's biological instruments. Now, let us connect the unchanging source to every investigation in this series. In our investigation of time, we establish that the block universe contains all moments simultaneously. The unchanging source is the block universe's timeless structure, the mathematical framework that does not flow, that does not change, and that contains every moment in an eternal, simultaneous, unchanging present. The temporal flow that the consciousness experiences is the surface's perspective on the source's timelessness, the sequential readout of a structure that is, in itself, complete and unchanging. In our investigation of distance, we establish that space emerges from entanglement. The unchanging source is the entanglement structure, the quantum correlations that do not change when the spatial geometry changes, that persist when the distances shift, and that constitute the unchanging informational substrate from which the changing spatial world is projected. In our investigation of gravity, we establish that space-time curvature is the geometric expression of entanglement. The unchanging source is the entanglement itself, the quantum correlations that produce the curvature, but that are not affected by the curvature they produce. The gravity changes, it varies with mass distribution, it fluctuates at the quantum level, it produces the tidal forces that destroy structures and the gravitational waves that propagate through space. But the entanglement that produces the gravity does not change it, is the unchanging informational structure from which the changing gravitational geometry emerges. In our investigation of death and grief, we established that the information constituting a person is not destroyed at death. The unchanging source is the informational conservation, the quantum unitarity that preserves every bit of information through every transformation, every dissolution, and every entropic process that the second law prescribes. The person's form dissolves, the person's information persists, and the persistence of the information in the unchanging source is the physical basis of the tradition's assurance that death is not the end, that something persists when the surface dissolves, something that the source preserves, and that the source's unchanging nature protects from the dissolution that the surface undergoes. In our investigation of the quantum Zeno effect, we establish that continuous observation sustains quantum states. The unchanging source is the continuous observer, the awareness that sustains the quantum states through its unceasing observation, that holds the physical world in existence through the continuous act of perception, and that constitutes the mechanism by which the unchanging produces and maintains the changing surface that the second law progressively dissolves. In our investigation of the principle of least action, we establish that the universe follows the optimal path. The unchanging source is the optimization criterion, the mathematical principle that selects, from among all possible paths, the path that minimizes the action and that produces the elegant, economical, beautiful physical world that the least action generates. The criterion does not change. The specific path changes. It depends on the initial conditions, the boundary conditions, and the specific configuration of the physical system. But the criterion by which the path is selected is the same everywhere, at every time, for every system, the unchanging principle that governs the changing world. In our investigation of the inseparable quark, we establish that isolation is forbidden. The unchanging source is the field, the continuous, undivided, all-pervading quantum field from which every particle arises and to which every particle returns. The field does not change when the particles change. The field is the ocean, the particles are the waves, and the prohibition against isolation is the prohibition against the wave separating from the ocean against the surface detaching from the source. In our investigation of evolution, we establish that evolution is a quantum algorithm computing toward consciousness. The unchanging source is the algorithm's substrate, the mathematical structure on which the computation runs, the timeless informational landscape through which the evolutionary process navigates, and the unchanging framework that determines which computations are possible and which outcomes the algorithm can produce. In our investigation of the cosmic neural network, we establish that the universe may be a mind. The unchanging source is the mind's awareness, the conscious ground that perceives through every node of the network, that is not affected by the birth or death of individual nodes, and that constitutes the unchanging awareness in which the changing neural activity occurs. In our investigation of déjà vu, we establish that consciousness can access temporal information beyond the present moment. The unchanging source is the information's repository, the holographic boundary that contains every moment's information simultaneously, and that the consciousness, under conditions of sufficient coherence, can access directly, perceiving the source's timeless information content from within the surface's temporal flow. In our investigation of reincarnation, we established that consciousness may manifest at multiple space-time coordinates. The unchanging source is the consciousness that manifests the unchanging awareness that takes on different forms at different locations in the block, expressing itself through different bodies, different personalities, and different lives, while remaining, in its essential nature, unchanged by any of the forms it temporarily inhabits. In our investigation of the hidden layer, we established that the visible world is a surface concealing a deeper reality. The unchanging source is the hidden layer itself, the informational, holographic, possibly conscious ground from which the visible surface is projected and that persists, unchanged, while the surface that it projects undergoes the entropic dissolution that the second law prescribes. In our investigation of vibration, we established that the universe is made of vibrations in quantum fields. The unchanging source is the field, the continuous, space-filling, ground-state vibrating substrate that persists when every specific vibration has ceased. The particles come and go, the waves arise and dissolve, but the field remains vibrating at its irreducible zero-point energy, sustaining the vacuum's activity and providing the medium in which every specific vibration is produced and in which every specific vibration is absorbed. In our investigation of time travel, we established that time is navigable. The unchanging source is the timeless landscape through which the consciousness navigates the block universe's eternal structure, perceived from different perspectives by the consciousness that traverses it through speed, gravity, contemplative practice, or the simple sequential processing of the brain. In our investigation of information leakage, we established that dreams may contain fragments of other realities. The unchanging source is the multiverse's total wave function, the complete, unchanging, all-containing quantum state from which every branch arises, and that contains every branch simultaneously, without being affected by the specific events that unfold in any particular branch. Every investigation in this series has been an investigation of the unchanging source from a different angle. The time investigation examined the source's temporal quality. The distance investigation examined the source's spatial quality. The evolution investigation examined the source's computational quality. The neural network investigation examined the source's conscious quality. And this investigation has examined the source directly, asking what it is, what its features are, what the traditions say about it, and what it means for the consciousness that perceives it. The answer is now clear. The source is the unchanging reality that the changing world expresses. It is timeless, symmetric, holographic, and possibly conscious. It is described by the physics as the conserved quantities, the constant laws, and the eternal mathematical structure. It is described by the traditions as Brahman, Nibbana, the Logos, the Tao, and the ground of being. And it is perceived by the trained consciousness as the unchanging awareness that is present in every moment of experience and that does not participate in the change that it perceives. Now we must state the objections. The first objection is that the unchanging quantities identified by physics, energy, information, symmetries, mathematical structure are abstract. They are not conscious. They do not have awareness. They do not have the qualities that the contemplative traditions attribute to the source. The energy is conserved, but it does not know that it is conserved. The information is preserved, but it does not experience its own preservation. The mathematical structure is eternal, but it does not feel its own eternity. The physics unchanging quantities are structural constants, not conscious beings. The second objection is that the contemplative tradition's reports of perceiving the unchanging source are experiential and not independently verifiable. The reports may reflect genuine perceptions of the source's nature, or they may reflect the projection of the human desire for permanence onto an impermanent reality, the psychological need to believe that something endures, expressed as the spiritual perception of an unchanging ground. These objections are serious. The identification of the physics' unchanging quantities with the tradition's unchanging source is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. The convergence between the physics and the traditions is suggestive, but not definitive, and the question of whether the unchanging structure is also an unchanging consciousness remains open, answerable, perhaps, only by a future science that integrates the structural descriptions of physics with the experiential reports of the contemplative traditions. The philosopher Ken Wilber has proposed a framework for integrating the physics and the traditions that respects both the objections and the convergence. Wilber argues that reality has an exterior and an interior, that every physical system has both a structural description, the physics, and an experiential description, the consciousness. The exterior of the unchanging reality is the conserved quantities, the constant symmetries, and the eternal mathematical structure that the physics describes. The interior of the unchanging reality is the awareness, the knowing, and the experiential presence that the contemplative traditions describe. The exterior and the interior are not two different realities. They are two perspectives on the same reality, the outside view and the inside view of the unchanging source. Wilber's framework does not prove that the source is conscious, but it provides a conceptual space in which the physics and the traditions can coexist without contradiction, a space in which the structural descriptions of the physics and the experiential reports of the traditions are complementary perspectives on the same unchanging reality rather than competing claims about different realities. So what does this mean for you? It means that you are living at the intersection of two realities. One reality is the changing surface, the world of birth and death, of growth and decay, of entropy and dissolution, the world that the second law governs and that the heat death will eventually claim. The other reality is the unchanging source, the world of conserved energy, conserved information, constant symmetries, and eternal mathematical structure, the world that the second law does not govern, and that the heat death cannot touch. You inhabit both realities simultaneously. Your body belongs to the surface. It is changing, decaying, approaching the dissolution that the second law prescribes. Your consciousness may belong to the source. It may be the unchanging awareness that the contemplative traditions describe, the awareness that perceives the body's change without participating in it, that perceives the surface's decay without being decayed by it, and that persists, unchanged, when the body that it animated dissolves. The recognition of the dual habitation is not merely theoretical, it is experiential. Right now, as you read these words, you can verify both dimensions of your existence. You can feel the body, the changing, aging, sensation-producing biological organism that the second law is dissolving, and you can notice the awareness in which the feeling occurs, the unchanging, ageless, non-physical awareness that perceives the body's sensations, and that is not itself a sensation. The body changes from moment to moment, the sensations shift, the posture adjusts, the breath moves in and out. The awareness does not change. It is the same awareness that perceived the first word of this paragraph, and that is perceiving this word now. The body has aged since you began reading. The awareness has not. This is not a philosophical argument. It is an observation that you can make right now, in this moment, without any special training or any contemplative expertise. The observation is, the awareness in which the changing experience occurs does not itself change. The thoughts change, the emotions change, the sensations change. The awareness in which they occur does not. And the recognition of this unchanging awareness, the simple, direct, immediately available recognition that the awareness is not changing, while everything it perceives is changing, is the beginning of the transformation that every tradition describes. The contemplative practices are the technologies for shifting the center of gravity from the surface to the source, for relocating the sense of identity from the changing body and the changing mind to the unchanging awareness that perceives them both. The shift does not require you to leave the surface. You cannot leave the surface. You are embodied, you are biological, you are a physical being in a physical world, but you can recognize that the surface is not all you are, that beneath the changing body and the changing mind, there is an unchanging depth that the body's aging does not affect, that the mind's fluctuations do not disturb, and that the second law's dissolution does not reach. The physicist Max Planck, whose discovery of the quantum launched the revolution that revealed the unchanging structure beneath the changing surface, described his own perception of the relationship between the two, with the clarity of a man who had spent his life at the boundary between them. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. You are part of the mystery. You are the point at which the source becomes aware of itself through the surface, the point at which the unchanging mathematical structure, projected into the temporal world through the holographic encoding, achieves the specific configuration of biological complexity that produces self-awareness. You are the universe's self-knowledge, the source's perception of itself through the surface's biological instruments. And the contemplative practice is the refinement of this self-knowledge, the sharpening of the source's perception of itself through the specific, unique, irreplaceable instrument that is your consciousness. You are part of the mystery. You are the changing surface that decays. You are the unchanging source that persists. And the mystery is not which one you are, but how you are both, how the eternal and the temporal coexist in a single being, how the unchanging awareness and the changing body inhabit the same location, and how the source and the surface, which the physics describes as aspects of the same reality, are experienced by you as the dual nature of your own existence. The traditions say, the duality is an illusion. The source and the surface are one. The unchanging and the changing are one. The eternal and the temporal are one. And the recognition of this oneness, the direct, experiential, practice-dependent recognition that you are not merely the wave on the ocean, but the ocean itself is the liberation that every tradition describes and that every investigation in this series has been pointing toward. Everything decays. The stars will burn out, the galaxies will disperse, the universe will reach the heat death, and every structure, every organism, every civilization, and every body that has ever existed will be returned to the featureless equilibrium of maximum entropy. But the source will remain, the energy will be conserved, the information will be preserved, the symmetries will be constant, the mathematical structure will be eternal, and the consciousness, if the traditions are correct, if the consciousness is the source's awareness rather than the surface's product, will persist, unchanged, through the dissolution of every surface it has ever animated. The surface is thin, the source is deep, the surface decays, the source remains, and you are deeper than the surface. You have always been deeper than the surface. The traditions have been saying this for millennia. The physics has been confirming it for a century. And the recognition, the direct, experiential, life-transforming recognition that you are not the wave, but the ocean, not the surface, but the source, not the changing, but the unchanging, is available to you right now, in this moment, through the practice of turning the attention inward, past the body, past the thoughts, past the emotions, past every changing content of experience, to the unchanging awareness that perceives them all, and that is, in its nature, identical to the source from which the universe itself arises. The source is not elsewhere. It is here. It has always been here. And the awareness with which you are reading these words is not separate from it. It is it.